what we're going to do today is I'm going to kind of show you the game plan in a bit, but essentially we're going to try and break down, okay, exactly for course 1, 2, 3, 4, what are the changes we're actually facing? How much is it? Is it actually a lot? Is it just a little bit? And that way you guys will actually be a little bit more prepared and a little bit more organized when you go back and go into your guys' studying. Okay. So let me just show you a few things first. I mean, let's just talk about TRESA in general, right? Because TRESA is kind of shaking up a lot of the students right now. So to give you a small recap, TRESA specifically was put into play after REBA and actually quite a while ago. But just recently, just now, essentially, they've been able to factor it into the courses. So really, when we talk about REBA to TRESA, we're talking about this transition in terms of the actual kind of laws that govern the real estate industry. So TRESA pretty much, even the law itself, if you take a look at REBA's law and TRESA's law, it's very much a copy and paste, but there's simply some additions and some updates that they've done. And so you can kind of see the timeline here, what we're looking at. You kind of see how we had this REBA, which kind of governed real estate from 2002 to 2023. TRESA kind of phased in, and they were phasing it in slowly in different phases. And now finally in 2025, so it's not even on the map, but now in 2025, they've been able to factor into the courses. Now, there's many reasons why they did this change. Specifically, we're looking at things like they want to make it easier for realtors. They want to make it easier for people that are trying to work with realtors. It simplifies some things. Personally, from my opinion, I do think TRESA was a much needed change, and it's good that it's finally come in. But obviously, there's different ways to go about it. One of the ways that they're going about it is they're changing the content for you guys now, which obviously sucks. But realistically, this change should have already happened back in like 2020 or 2023. So truth is, like I've been, for example, doing these monthly kind of group sessions for a few years, and the people I were teaching back in since like 2022 even, I would have to tell them, hey guys, like when you go into the real industry, it's going to be a bit different. And that's kind of annoying if you're on course 4 and you're preparing and you're studying, and then you have to go in and kind of deal with something different, right? Now, for the content changes though, there's a few. We're going to look at some of the specifics, kind of what are we exactly are we talking about. So with this, we have a few different updates. First of all, in terms of programs, which you guys should all already know by now, September 30th, the Humber program, the Reba program has ended. TRESA has now taken over, right? We look at different TRESA updates for the course content. The program is now offered by 4 colleges instead of just one, and that is called Algonquin Career College Group, Fleming College, and Humber Polytechnic. So there's been some kind of shifting around. Like if you're still with Humber, if you started with Humber from before this change has happened, you can still continue with them. You can switch over to a new college. You can start with a new college. Just some of the delivery methods might be different. Now it is looking like most of the exams will be the same because they're delivered by the same um, exam provider, which is Measure Learning, I believe. But the way they deliver content can be different. Although from what I've seen, they're all delivering it online. So I don't think there's going to be much of a difference. And I believe the prices should be relatively the same as well. So with that being said, in terms of the actual updates, content-wise, so for the courses, we're going to go a bit more in depth into this time. But for the courses, we're affecting most of the courses, but mostly we're affecting C1, C2, and the simulations the most. Now, there are some changes to course 3, and we have a little bit of changes to course 4 and simulation 2. But mostly, if I were you guys, if you're on the first C1 and C2 or the sims, that's where I would make an extra effort to try and study the TRESA changes. Obviously, it's all going to be already in your course that you're going to buy. But as many of you guys know, if some of you guys have been in the group sessions with me, we try not to study so much from those slides because they can be very, very long and very repetitive. So my advice to you would be if you're on one of these top courses over here, so one of these ones here, right? You want to make sure that you probably give a little bit more attention to TRESA. And that can be hard now, especially because some of the materials are not updated yet, right? Even past it may not be fully updated yet for those TRESA changes. But with that being said, if you are on C3, C4, or the simulations, simulation 2 specifically, you can ease out a little bit. After going into depth into all of these stuff, and even myself, I'm currently updating all of the materials I use to teach, there are not as many changes as you might imagine. There are updates that kind of trickle down, and I'll show you guys later. Essentially, some major changes for content, because they're so fundamental to real estate, like for example, multiple representation, because there are changes about that, it can trickle into other courses just because we see multiple representation no matter what, whether it's residential or commercial as well. So because of that, we have this trickle down effect, which seems like these changes affect everything. We're really, it's just something you'll have to keep in mind. It's not necessarily going to change the content too much, if that makes sense. Okay. Now, in terms of actually looking at the content changes, we're going to go more in depth. I'm going to show you each and every one. If you guys are new here and if you don't already know me, um, I basically completed my courses a few years ago. And these are kind of some of the scores that I got a few years ago as well. I completed them all, and then I kind of started a Facebook group, which many of you guys are from. So welcome. And that's where I put some of the free notes in. I put some of the free content in there. And then over time, I started doing these kind of monthly group sessions. I started teaching people. We started doing different groups, C1, C2, C3, C4. And then over the last, 3, 4 years, we've been able to help like 600 plus students, which has been really, really nice. And I see some of you guys in here today. So as always, it's a pleasure. And there are tons of free resources as well. So after this, or if you haven't already, I would highly recommend going to that site to download some of the free stuff. There's notes, there's checklists, there's fees for your real estate license journey. There's a quiz online, free practice questions. And for those of you guys that are here today, at the end of the session, if you don't already have it, I'm going to be dropping you guys my free TRESA notes. So I recommend sticking till the end if you don't have those. But if you do have to leave early, you guys will get the recording for this as well. So don't worry about that. Now, for the actual things that we're going to look at, keep in mind, just as a kind of, I like to start with this as a kind of a self-limiting belief breaking kind of exercise. Often when I see people come to me and they talk about passing the exam, they believe it's going to take months. They believe it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of effort. And it's going to be very, very hard. Now, the course is, if you go to buy the course, which many of you guys have already done that, you'll see it has the recommended time. Now, the recommended time is often something like 50 hours, 80 hours, 100 hours, 200 hours. From my experience, if you're studying well and you're studying smart, those are extremely exaggerated. So usually, like I said, people come to me, they say, hey, it's going to take months. It's going to be very hard. It's going to be very stressful. Usually when I teach group sessions, we only study like about 1 to 2 hours a day. And we're just doing a few practice questions in total. And they're usually able to pass within 3, 4 weeks. And this is for any course that you're doing, whether you're doing course 1, 2, 3, or 4, even with these TRESA changes. And I'm going to show you some of the techniques today. Study smart, and you'll be able to reduce your study time a lot. And I mean, even if you're in these group sessions, or even if you're not, even if you're studying by yourself, remember, I did all these courses by myself as well. I didn't even use Pass It. I didn't use Minicram. I didn't use any other tools. So it is highly, highly possible. Okay. Now, 4 things we're going to cover today. So first, we're going to look at exactly where TRESA shows up course by course. So that was just kind of the intro, the recap. We're going to go course by course in depth in terms of what actually shows up. Number 2, we're going to look at the FAST method, which applies to TRESA. This was a method I introduced about, I think, 2 or 3 months ago, which is sort of the baseline of how I try to structure the studies sessions for my group sessions I do monthly. So this is kind of the technique. This should give you a little bit more structure and organization for what you guys are going to do. Number 3, we're going to look at some TRESA exam scenarios and common questions. This one is going to be really fun because sometimes it's really easy to understand these concepts, but the questions can get a little bit tricky. So I'll show you guys some questions, kind of what they'd look like, and we'll go through one of these scenarios, which can be a little bit harder. Okay. And then number 4, we're going to look at a sprint plan. So this kind of goes hand in hand with the FAST method. I'll show you guys a sample sprint plan of kind of what I use to kind of structure the group sessions. That was kind of how I based essentially these. When I do these group sessions, I tell people, hey, you're going to pass in 3 weeks. There's a way to structure it so that you can actually meet that goal, right? And to be able to do consistently month after month with different students, it does take a little bit more planning. So I'll show you guys kind of what mine looks like. Obviously, I'm not saying this is going to work for everybody, so you do have to take it with a grain of salt. see how much time you can invest into it, see how much effort you can invest into it. But I'll show you guys kind of what I use, and you can see if it, you can use something similar. Okay. So that is the game plan. Are we all ready to go? Give me a thumbs up. We're all still here. We're ready to go on this Friday evening. Yes, thumbs up. Okay, beautiful. All right, awesome. Okay, number one, this is the 8 modules that we deal with TRESA. So if you guys have already done the TRESA kind of self-learning module, you would have already seen these. So this is just a little bit of an overview. We have things about relationships and trading real estate. This is one of the biggest ones here. So number one, this is really, really big. Relationships and trading, number two, that's really, really big. And representation agreements is also very big. Some of the smaller stuff happen to be the code of ethics. Although things have changed, they're not as important for your exam. Things like protection of property are not as important for your exam. And things like SRP disclosures, information guide, they're actually just piggybacking off of these kind of first 3 things that we looked at. Okay, so there is a repetition even within the TRESA modules themselves. So if I were you, what I'm really looking at is, okay, when I'm going to go study my course, and the way I like to do this with my students is I say, okay, take the checklist that I've given to you guys, which are online for free. Look at the checklist for course 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever course you're on, and look at which one of these modules are affecting some of those parts in that checklist. And it's very easy to see if you're on course 2, for example, you'll see it's very obvious that multiple representation is huge. So anything about relationships is huge for course 2. There's also a lot about representation agreements. So in course 2, we have the APS, we have the listening agreement, we have the buyer representation agreement, and we used to have the customer service agreement, which no longer exists. So that's why we know these 3 modules are going to be very big, because they affect a good portion of course 2. And then we also talk a lot about disclosures and offers. So that will also be important for course 2. Now, if you look at something like course 3, when you go to study the course and when you look at the checklist, you're going to notice there's not as much about multiple representation, which means these are not as important for course 2. We still do have representation agreements, which means, okay, that is an important module. And we still do have offers and disclosures and acknowledgements. So that's kind of how you look at how do we actually discern, right? Like what is actually going to be important or not. Now, in terms of the courses and the actual changes, here are the priorities that I would recommend. Like I said, when you grab those free notes I'm going to give you, they're pretty short. So I do recommend going through them all. It's not extensive, but these are the kind of the priorities of things that you want to look at specifically. So first and number one, most important, we're looking at new terminology. So there's a lot of different terminology that we're looking at. Self-represented parties, designated representatives. There's also a lot of new forms. Not a lot, but there's a few new forms like the RICO information guide, which is now mandatory. There's no longer customer service agreements. So those are some of the changes we have there. Offer rule changes we'll go through. Code of ethics, they've changed some small minor aspects of that. Because that was not tested a lot on the previous course, it's not going to be a big part on this next course. So I wouldn't worry too much, but that is part of the changes. Enforcement changes and PREC, P-R-E-C. Enforcement changes happen to be that TRESA has actually allowed RICO to now enforce real estate bylaws a little bit stricter. So there's stricter rules on all of these things, offers, disclosures, acknowledgements. And one of the other parts of that is PRECs. Now, PRECs you guys may have already heard of. PRECs are essentially a way for real estate agents to sort of incorporate as a realtor. This wasn't always allowed, and this was something that just came in 2020 when they actually put TRESA into play. So this allows you as a realtor to incorporate and put your real estate business as its own business, which means you can now write off certain expenses and you can claim certain things, to reduce your taxes, which was not always a thing. So that is another thing that may show up. Okay. Now, specifically, course by course, I highly recommend you take a screenshot or a snap or a picture of this. These are the course 1, 2, 3, 4, the types of kind of weightage of how many changes are we actually looking at, and the changes that we would see in each of these courses. So we look at course 1, you're going to see I say moderate. Again, this is based on my perspective. It may change, but I say it's moderate change. And we're looking at things like the customer category has now been removed. We now have client or self-represented party only, no customers. Brokerages are now legal agents, not the salesperson. That basically means that brokerages are way, way more important now than they used to be, especially in deals. Because when you did multiple representation, now with self-represented parties and the elimination of customers, there's a lot more responsibilities for brokerages to actually make decisions about how they want to run their brokerage and their agents. I'll show a little bit in a second, but essentially, brokerages now get to decide whether they want everybody to be designated representatives or everybody to simply be brokerage representatives. And I'll show you that in a second. And then there's some code of ethic changes which are going to affect course one as well. Now, as you can see, these are not really that extensive. But when we talk about TRESA making big, big ripples in the content changes, we say that because small changes like this, like eliminating customers, actually affect a good, decent amount of the course, right? There's a good portion of the course that is going to be affected by that. And now implementing self-represented parties, that also affects a decent amount of things in the course as well. So they can kind of trickle down to many other things. For course two, this is the heaviest. So if you're on course two and you're still studying for that, you will be facing a decent amount of changes for this. This basically faces all of the TRESA stuff because they're all of them are pretty much around offer process, multiple representation agreements. So we're looking at stuff like multiple versus designated representatives, offer transparency, eliminating customer service, obviously, agency creation and termination are updated as well, and then your representation agreements. So pretty much all across the board. If you're on course two, that's going to be very, very important. Then course three and course four are both light. So there are changes, but they are not nearly as heavy. And like I said, simulation one, because simulation one is very much a reflection of course two, simulation one does have a lot of changes. Now, simulation two, usually being a reflection of course four, simulation two does not have as many changes. Okay, so I'll repeat that again. Simulation one, heavy. There are a lot of changes. Simulation two, very light. I would take that similar to course four. Okay. Now, essentially for course three, course four, there's a lot of repetition. There's not a lot of things that do change, like totally, but there is just some overlap from course one to course two, right? So when we look at TRESA changes in total, like I said, my notes are only about 8 pages. They're not really extensive, but they can affect a decent amount. Now here, you're just going to see a lot of stuff still about condos, status certificates, leases, but they're just all framed under TRESA, okay? In other words, all of these stuff are now affected just by that TRESA change. That's really the only difference. That simply means that when we look at condos now, or when we look at deals, they may put in some questions about multiple representation. They may put in questions about designated representation. Even in course three, even when sometimes it may not be as important or may not be as common when we deal with condos. So there will just be repetition. Same with course four. Commercial agreements get affected even less by these things, but they can still be affected, right? They can still be affected by the designated and brokerage representations. They can still be affected by code of ethics and by the different kind of forms we may have. Okay. So for the code of ethics specifically, one thing I'll add here is it's more likely they will put this on course four. Of course, like I said, you'll get this kind of throughout the courses, but on course four, it's more likely to be tested simply because course four, being commercial real estate, has a lot more restrictions. It has a lot more regulations. And so because of that, code of ethics is fairly important for commercial real estate. So the ethic changes that we'll see, which are minor, they will affect course four, and it's possible they may test you on those things. Okay. So like I said, if you haven't already, take a snap, take a screenshot. These are kind of the changes we'll be looking at. Course two, course one, heaviest, course three, course four, I wouldn't worry too much. Okay. Okay. Now, to go a little bit more in depth, So I'm just going to go through some of the things that we also went through, I think about 2 months ago in the last webinar. Just some review on some of the key points in TRESA. I'll send you the notes later so you can look at them later. When we look at self-represented parties, this is kind of the new thing that they've put in. So they've eliminated customers and they've now introduced these self-represented parties. Now, these guys essentially, basically what this means is as a realtor, you either work with a client or they're not your client. End of story. What used to happen before is we have clients, we have customers, and customers you still offer services, but you don't offer full services. In other words, you can simply give them advice based on material facts. I mean, you can simply tell them like, hey, your house looks old. You can't tell them, hey, because your house looks old, I would maybe put this in this change, renovate it so you can sell it for more. That would be advice, and you weren't allowed to give advice. Customers created a lot of confusion for realtors, for students, and for people that actually were in, trying to get services from realtors because they didn't understand why customers were not getting the full service or were still paying money. So they eliminated customers. Now you have clients, you give your full service to clients, and you have self-represented parties. We do not do anything for self-represented parties unless it benefits our client. So in other words, if I'm working with a buyer who's my client, and there's this homeowner selling their house by themselves, which would be a self-represented party. If I have my buyer client with me and we put an offer on the property, offer gets accepted, what's going to happen is I, as a realtor for my buyer, I'm probably going to be in charge of doing most of the paperwork, right? Which means I'm going to contact the seller, get them to fill stuff out, but I'm not going to give them any advice, any opinion, or any sort of help whatsoever. I'm fully going to help my client. The only reason I'm going to call them and send them offers and agreements is to get the deal through for my client, and that is it. Okay, that didn't used to happen before. Customers, it was a little bit more confusion. Additionally, we're going to have the RICO information guide. If you don't know what that is, it's basically what it sounds like. It's like a brochure of kind of what it looks like to do business with the realtor. So we're going to give this to the self-represented party. It basically gives them a little brochure of what are their rights, what are their responsibilities, and we're going to give them the SRP disclosure form. Now, that disclosure form basically says everything I just said, and it tells them that, well, we can't really help you out. We're not going to give you advice. We're not going to give you opinions. You cannot rely on us at all. Okay, so RICO information guide, just to clarify, it did exist before. It just wasn't mandatory. So now it is, and it's more strict. So you have to give it immediately. The SRP disclosure form did not exist, and now it's a new form that you do have to give to them. Okay. Now, the second part of this goes into brokerage representation models. There's two specifically. We have designated representation and we have brokerage representation. Now, brokerage representation is what we had before. This is what existed in REBA, essentially. What that means is if you have one client, even if I am the person representing this client and I have my buddy John, who's from the same brokerage, even though I'm their representative, because me and John work for the same brokerage, technically we all represent the client. Okay, so the way that they used to frame it was, well, the realtor represents the brokerage and the brokerage represents the client. And this basically means like, yeah, I represent this entire brokerage and this entire brokerage will represent that client, although I'm the only person that's going to deal with them. This basically just meant that on paper, if I left the brokerage, I couldn't take the client with me because the brokerage owns that person. If I, for example, died, it wouldn't really matter because they could just give it to another agent. And thirdly, the reason why this created so much confusion was, well, on paper, if the entire brokerage represents this client, that means that, let's say John has a buyer for my seller client. Well, me and John are from the same brokerage. So now, technically, because we all represent both clients, we can technically pass information on to each other. So the assumption was that before, or at least in brokerage representation, information will be passed between agents. Okay. And this was not good, obviously, for the clients, because you want an agent who's going to fight for you, right? But if I tell John, hey, my seller wants to leave in about 2 weeks, John tells that to the buyer and says, hey, the seller's desperate to sell their property. Now that puts the seller at a disadvantage. And that becomes a whole issue. Okay. So this is where multiple representation came into play, because multiple representation, the biggest issue was that, well, we have, well, two scenarios. One brokerage representing a buyer and seller. Remember, this is the same deal or same transaction. Or we have one brokerage with two buyer offers, and that's on the same property. And this just meant that, well, information can be passed through. And now the rules to kind of mitigate that was, okay, if you're a realtor involved in this multiple representation deal, any of these two scenarios, do not give advice, do not give opinions. You cannot be biased. You cannot really help them, which was very, very disadvantageous. Okay. Now, the change that has happened in TRESA is we have this thing now called designated representation. All that means is now we can actually make a deal where this agent is going to represent this client. And that is it. These agents are not considered representatives, and we have no relation to any of them. And so now the need for multiple representation has been greatly eliminated. Because, well, if I have a situation where I have a buyer and a seller, I could represent the seller with a designated representation, which means I'm not going to tell John any information. And John can represent the buyer with designated representation, which means John's not going to tell me anything about his buyer. So now we're good. And now we don't need this multiple representation. This was a very confusing thing. It was very annoying because you always have to get disclosures. And sometimes people that we worked with didn't really like it. Now, I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but the issue with this is brokerages get to choose which representation they want to do. So when you join a brokerage, even if you tell your broker, hey, I only want to do designated, the brokerage could say, no, we are a brokerage representation model, so you got to deal with that. And you're still going to have to send out these multiple representation disclosures. You're still going to have to do it like we always have done. That's possible. However, often, and what's happened today, is we have brokerages that will do both models. So it's not essentially they'll have designated and brokerage representation. So stay with me. There are possibilities where you may have something like a situation where one, agent A represents the seller in designated representation, which means, again, there's only one agent representing one client. So there's no need to kind of have multiple representation technically. However, the buyer, so agent B from the same brokerage, represents the buyer in brokerage representation. This is a little bit of an issue because this still means multiple representation. Okay. In other words, I'm representing the seller, designated rep. I'm the only one with that client. I'm not going to share information. However, because the buyer, for whatever reason, chose to do brokerage representation, that means technically I'm still looped into his buyer. John, that guy John, who's agent B, he can still tell me information about his buyer, which means I could still tell my seller, which means we now need multiple representation rules. Now we have to sign the disclosures. We cannot be biased. We cannot give them opinions. We cannot give them advice, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so this is kind of some of the changes that have been into play. Okay, so essentially, that's kind of what we're looking at with some of these changes. This is one of the biggest parts. So hopefully this made sense. Again, you guys are gonna get the recording, so feel free to watch it back. But that is essentially what we deal with: brokerage and designated representation. Okay. Now, multi-rep, we've already kind of mentioned this, but this occurs if A brokerage or the same agent represents both sides. And the risk is, again, you just have no undivided loyalty. You cannot give advice, you cannot give opinions. And it's always got to be disclosed and consented. So it just elongates the deal and it makes it worse for our clients because we cannot advise them anymore as we would like to. Okay. Now, in terms of offers for this, a few things have changed. One is before we were only allowed to do blind bidding, which meant you were only allowed to disclose the number of offers. Now, today, we're actually allowed to share offer content. As long as the seller is okay with it, the seller is allowed to share offer content to the other people in the deal. So if I'm a seller and I have 5 different offers on my property, before if a buyer asked me, hey, what did that person offer? I wouldn't be able to tell them the content. I would only be able to tell them, well, I can't tell you anything about it other than we have 4 other offers. Today, the seller can say, well, this guy offered me 1.1. This other guy offered me 1.2 with so and so and so condition. So they can do that. And the only restriction is they cannot disclose any personal identifying information. So they cannot say the name of those buyers or any information that would link them to the actual offer. Okay. So as you can imagine, because offers are integral to the whole course 1, 2, 3, and 4, you can see this affecting many, many courses. Okay. And this is the rest of the kind of general changes we're looking at. Many of these we've already kind of gone through, so I won't go through these again in depth. But when you guys go through those notes, you're going to see many of the stuff that we went through in much more detail. So I highly recommend going through that. Now, in interest of time, I'm going to go on to the next part, which is sample questions. So this is a little bit more fun. What we're going to do is I'm going to give you guys a minute each to read the question and then pop your answer in the chat. So this is not a test, so don't be scared if you get it wrong. But if you're here, you're sitting down, you're here on this Friday evening, read the question, pop an answer in the chat. I'm going to give you 1 minute, no more, and then I'll show you guys the answer, and we'll kind of go through it. I believe the first 2 questions are very easy. Even if you just paid attention today and you know nothing else about TRESA, it should be pretty easy. The third one, maybe a little bit more difficult. Okay. So let's start with number 1. I'll read it with you guys and then I'll let you guys take it from there. So a brokerage is representing both a landlord and a tenant in commercial lease negotiation under brokerage representation. Under TRESA, when must the brokerage obtain written disclosure and consent for multiple representation? Okay. So we represent both the landlord and tenant. It's brokerage representation, and they're asking you which one of these is correct or multiple rep. Okay. So I will give you guys a minute. Pop your answer in the chat, and then I'll give you guys the answer. Okay, I'm getting a lot of C's. You have about 20 seconds left. Okay, we'll take it up from here. So I think everybody put C, which means you guys are either all right or you guys are all wrong. I think, again, this one's pretty easy. So congratulations, you guys all got it right. Very good job. As soon as multiple representation is known and before the offer stage. This did not always happen. In REBA, is actually a little bit different. So TRESA actually requires earlier disclosure and written consent, not just at the offer time. So before, and I remember I used to, because I got my license essentially right when TRESA was into play. So there still was a lot of realtors that were still kind of working on the REBA stuff. And this was still a thing where you'd wait until the offer time to actually disclose, get any disclosures done. So this has to be as soon as it's known and often before the offer. So very well done. Won't spend too much other time on this. Pretty easy. Number two, another minute should be very easy as well. A seller instructs their brokerage to disclose competing offer details to all buyers. Under TRESA, which of the following statements is true? So if you were listening, this should be very, very easy. Okay, you have 1 minute. All right, you got 30 seconds. Okay, and we will take it from there. So this is actually one of the things that we just mentioned before. So offers, what can we disclose? So remember, before we were allowed to disclose only the number of offers. Uh, Now we are allowed to disclose details. And the question is, in terms of details, is it whether the buyer's consent or is it whether the seller's consent? Now, the answer, for those of you guys that put answers, very easy. It is C. So brokerages can disclose the offer details if the seller instructs. So it is a new option and it's based on seller instructions. So if you put an offer in and you don't want your details disclosed as a buyer, you probably shouldn't put an offer. They can't disclose personal ID, but anything else they can. Okay, good job. Now the next one is a hard one. At least I believe is a little bit harder. So I will give you a minute, minute and a half, and I'll explain each one a little bit more in depth than the first two. Uh, I'll let you guys read this on your own. Okay. So this is number three. Take a look at a small scenario, which we love. Read the answers and then put it in the chat. So 1 minute and a half. Okay, 45 seconds. Okay, this one's hard. Like I said, take a good look, think about it. Okay, final 15. Drop an answer if you haven't already. Again, it's not an exam. Just take a guess. Okay, let us take a look. So, we got a varying varying answer base for this one. So I think all across the board, A, B, C, D, even E. So let's take a look. Um, so we got a situation. This is actually very similar to the one I just described before, um, but it's still a little bit tricky. So a brokerage offers both designated and brokerage representation, right? We have John, a salesperson, and he is entering into designated representation with seller A. Okay. So designated rep with the seller. That's number one. Mary, another salesperson in the same brokerage, enters a brokerage representation with buyer B, who's interested in seller A's property. Okay. In other words, just to summarize, this is one of the techniques I recommend. When you have scenarios, try to summarize in your head really quick. So we have John represents seller. We have Mary represents buyer. John and Mary are from the same brokerage. Okay. And most important part is John is doing designated rep and Mary is doing brokerage rep. Now, if you guys were here for the other part of the webinar, you'll remember designated rep means one agent represents one client. There's no other disclosure of information with any other agent in the brokerage. Brokerage rep means technically all the representatives, all the agents in the brokerage have access to Mary's information for that deal. So they all collectively represent Mary. Okay. Now, what happens when we have these two together, right? Is that multiple rep? Is it not? Well, let's look at it this way. So we have A, which says this is not multiple rep because only John represents seller A, which is very plausible. B says this is multiple rep because one client is under designated, others under brokerage in the same in the same brokerage. C says it's not as long as they keep client info confidential. D says it is only if buyer makes an offer on seller A's property. Now, the explanation, as some of you guys got right, the correct answer is B. The correct answer is that this is multiple representation because we have one agent under designated and the other under brokerage. Why? Well, when you look at this, the default is brokerage representation, which means multiple representation. So when you have any sort of mix in any deal, we always default to brokerage rep. And when I say brokerage rep, if that's confusing, just remember, if there's a mix, default to the old system. And the old system always was multiple representation. So brokerage rep means you're collective, you all represent the clients together. So because you can disclose information within one another, it technically means we have multiple representation. We now have to set rules and disclosures. Okay. Now options A and C are tempting, but they're not right because you cannot split models. So it doesn't really matter if you keep client information confidential. Okay, so it doesn't matter if you keep client information confidential. It also doesn't matter that John only represents seller A. Because of the fact that there is some sort of brokerage rep, that means technically John also represents the buyer, which means two agents representing one client in the same deal. That is the definition of multiple representation. And D is tricky, but is not correct because, again, as we mentioned before, you have to disclose multiple rep as soon as it arises, not only at the offer stage. So it is still multiple rep even before they make an offer, as long as they're somewhat involved in some sort of the ecosystem in that deal, it still counts as multiple rep. Okay, so correct answer is B. I think that was maybe a little bit of a tricky one. Yeah, it can be a little bit tricky. We had answers across the board. This is more likely what you're going to get. So for first two were a warm up. This is sort of the scenarios we're going to be looking at. Now, I've done other webinars where I've gone in depth into MCQs, some of the techniques. Just to show you a little bit here, my recommendation is when you have questions like this, you always look for the keywords, which is like try to break down the situation into something very easy, like something you could explain to a 5-year-old, right? And then go into the answers and try to summarize the answers as well. A lot of the mistakes happen when people have to reread answers and reread the question. And you guys may have done this. You may have read B, you may have read C, and then you reread B, and then you reread the question, and you go back to B, and then you're like, oh, maybe it's D. That's a very common thing. So try to be structured, try to summarize the answer, summarize the MCQs, and then kind of make a decision based on that. Obviously, it's new for you guys all, so don't worry if you got it wrong, but that's some techniques. Okay. So well done. Now, final part before I let you guys go is the FAST method. This is just a little bit of a recap, but a little bit more applied to TRESA. So how should we actually study in terms of like getting this through fast? Because like I said, it can be done in 3-4 weeks. It doesn't have to take months. So these are some of the techniques that I use, I teach people. I would recommend to use them and try to tweak them to make it your own. Okay. So this consists of 4 parts. F stands for focus. A is active recall, which I've talked about a lot. S is sprints, and T is your timeline. Okay. So first is focus. You want to front load your focus, which means when you study, start with high impact topics. Okay. This means when we look at a checklist like this is an example of the checklist I have online for free. When you look at this checklist, we have modules 1, 2, 3, modules 4, module 5. Now, over here, you'll see this list of topics. Now, this doesn't list every specific thing in the module. If you want that, you go to the notes, or you go to the Humber slides, or whatever college slides you're using directly. This is to front load focus with the high impact topics, meaning things that show up often. This list was not created just out of guesswork. This was created out of teaching people consistently every month for the last 3 years. So these things come up naturally. And just like it's hard for you guys to learn completely new content and it takes a lot of time, it's hard for the colleges to rewrite content. So it's not like they're rewriting everything and redoing all the exams. Okay. It's very likely they're only going to change some certain parts of it. So you want to start with these topics when you go study. I highly recommend getting the checklist. It makes it easy for you because you can just piggyback off of what other people have done and seen before. Or if you want to do your own, you can do your own. But you want to go through the notes. And ideally, what I'd recommend is this is a good starting point, the checklist. Also go through Facebook groups, also go through Reddit, and just look for advice. People love to post advice in those groups. They say, hey, course 1, these are the questions I had. And you will start to see a pattern. And that's partly how you can kind of focus in terms of what modules and topics are important. Okay. So one of the things we mentioned here is like most important modules is module 6 and 7. Still going to be the case. And you're just going to have a little bit more TRESA changes involved in those modules. Okay. So that's pretty much it. So this is just an example for course 1. But front load your focus and don't follow the chapter order blindly. What that means is when we look at modules 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like I said over here, module 6 and 7 is the most important. So start with those modules. Why would you start backwards? Now, it's a little bit harder with course 1, I will admit, because you may not have any foundation of anything in real estate, any knowledge. So I can get that if you want to start from module 1. With course 2, 3, 4, highly recommend you start from the most important and hardest modules. Because what happens is, I see this sometimes with students, they will study for 3-4 weeks and they book their exam early, meaning they set a date. Now they're approaching their date, and for whatever reason, they didn't time it properly, and they have only a short amount of time to study all the modules. What happens is when you start from module 1, let's say you're on course 4, the most important modules for course 4 is 12 to 15, which means if you start on module 1 and you left 12 to 15 for the end, you're shooting yourself in the foot because those are the most important modules. Those are the ones with the most questions. If you spend an hour studying 12 to 15, that will net you a better score than spending an hour studying module 3, for example. So I highly recommend you kind of switch it up, go a little bit backwards. Okay. Second is active recall. So active recall is when you want to actively test your memory by trying to retrieve information instead of reviewing it. That means when I tell people, and I tell them in the groups as well, I say, hey guys, you need to review the notes. You need to review the content slides. That doesn't mean you just want to read it and sleep. We barely remember stuff that we read. You want to make sure you're actively testing yourself. This means, well, all of these benefits are going to happen. You're going to be able to strengthen memory pathways, get deeper processing. It shows you what you know and what you don't know, improves long-term retention. All that this means is when you study your notes, you will read it, but after you read a section, try to flip it over. Try to ask yourself, what do you remember? Explain in your own words. Write down the jot notes of the bullet points. However, it's going to force you to actively be there and be alive and be present, right? We've all sat through long lectures, maybe this one, where you kind of like phase out. You don't even know what he's saying, right? You just kind of go to sleep and, oh, okay, well, I did my study for the day. So you want to be engaged. Take notes, practice explaining things out loud. That will help a lot better. And this is just one of the stats out of many, many, many stats. People who use active recall remembered up to 80% of material 1 week later versus those that only you reread notes. And that was only 36%. So if you're just rereading notes, you failed an exam, you reread the notes, not a good strategy. Be active, do something different, be engaged. You're going to remember a lot more. And another thing why I brought up this stat specifically is this says 1 week later. You can imagine 2 weeks later, the 80% might drop down to 70 or 60, which is another reason why it's important to do your exam in a compressed timeline. I know it seems like it's sometimes very good to spend a month, 2 or 3 months doing your studying and doing your exam, but the longer you wait, the more you forget. So there is a sweet spot. I have found with my students the sweet spot to be between 3 to 6 weeks. So for longer courses, you can go on the longer side, but just keep in mind, the more weeks you wait and the less that you're reviewing and doing active recall, the more you're going to forget. So this often happens after about 4 weeks. You need more review than somebody who just did their exam in the 3rd week. Okay. You may be more prepared, but that is kind of the trade-off that you have to look at when you study. Okay. Third thing is sprints. Now, I've mentioned this before. Sprints are very, very important because this is used in all kinds of fields. It's for project management. So when you have a big project, like, hey, I need to study this big program, how do we segment our time and organize it so we can get shit done? Right? We got to get this stuff done. So this is just an example of I'll show you this example first. This is kind of an example of what it looks like, for example, for course 2. So when, for example, we do the group sessions, I've structured it in a way that we take all these tips into account, right? We're front loading the focus. So we're doing the hard modules first. As you can see, we're starting on week 1. We're focusing on 14 to 20, right? Second is we're doing active recall. This is for the students to do. I recommend. Some do it, some don't. The ones who do it are more successful. They will actively recall, they will be present, they'll be engaged when they study. And then you'll see we trickle down into just about 3.5 weeks, just around here, which is typically between 3.5 weeks and 4.5, I would say is when most students will do the exam from those group sessions. So we kind of divide it into the sprints. Now, although this might seem compressed, this might seem rapid for you guys, in the groups, we kind of compress the study stuff anyways, material. So we kind of focus on what shows up often. But even on your own, the sprint is possible. Maybe it'll take you till the 5th week, maybe till 6, but it's possible as long as you're studying smart, right? You want to use notes instead of those slides. You want to use active recall instead of just rereading so you remember more. Remembering more means studying less. And just drafting this plan and setting this goal by the end of the 5th week, I'm going to do my exam. This alone, this commitment you make to yourself sets you light years ahead of everybody else. Same thing in life. If you don't set your goals, if you don't write them down, you don't make a plan, it's very unlikely you're going to get it done. I think writing goals makes you about, 30% to 40% more likely to do them. So this is very, very important to have a plan. If you don't have a plan, make a plan for yourself. Okay. So as you can see, we kind of go through this course, the first week, we kind of go through 1420, and we also review it later. Same with 1 to 5. You'll see we do that and we review it later. That is done intentionally because modules 1420 and 1 to 5 are both very heavy. Now, modules 6 to 8 to 9 to 13 are not as heavy on the exam. So we make sure that we review it very close to our exam. We review those modules very close to the exam. And the easier ones we only do one time. This sets you up the best to get it done in a short amount of time. Again, we're not looking to get 100%. We're looking to pass this exam within 3 to 4 weeks, right? So you can make a very similar plan for TRESA, but I just showed you an example for course 2 because I think you can still use a similar plan, just making sure that you're taking into account TRESA changes. Maybe instead of 4 weeks, maybe it'll take you 5, just so you have some time to review TRESA. That's basically it. Okay. And I'll take some questions from the group in a second. Okay, final thing is timeline. When I talk about timeline, I'm talking about the total timeline. So the kind of structure of when do you want to finish your license, actually become a realtor. It's very important to work backwards. Okay. So most students, they wait until they feel ready. They don't track their pace. They let distractions come in the way and they want to pass faster, but they don't put in the work. It's the hard reality. It happens. Everybody's busy. The truth is, how bad do you actually want to become a realtor? Is it right for you? These are questions you got to ask yourself before. And if it is, then make that decision, make the commitment, and go full in. It's not a short journey. So if you're in the start of your process, maybe you haven't even started it, it's not an easy journey, okay? It does take work, it does take effort, it takes a lot of money as well. So it is a huge commitment. But if you do make the commitment, well, you might as well go full in because there's no point half-assing something you're going to try. You know, the longer that you stay out of the market, the less money you're making. That's just how it is. Someone who gets licensed in 6 months will be making money much quicker than someone who gets licensed in a year, given that everything else is equal, right? Now, when we talk about compressing timelines and planning backwards, what that means is you want to start by choosing an exam date, use sprint deadlines to create your urgency for yourself, and you adjust every week to stay on schedule or to move your exam date. What that means is when we look at these sprints, they're not dead kind of fixed schedules. Okay. When I have these students come to the class, I tell them, hey, we're going to try and do this in 3 or 4 weeks. Some of you will do it sooner, and some do. Some of you will do it later, and some do as well. But the important thing is you have to evaluate every week. What worked this week? What didn't work? What do I need to adjust? Right? This is very effective for people that run businesses, for example. Every Saturday or Sunday, you do a week of planning. What does my week look like? Right? And you evaluate your last week. What worked? What didn't work? What can I do to improve? When you do this, it makes you a lot more likely to stick on timeline. Because even if one exam might take us like an extra week because we move this exam day, that's okay because now we can plan for, okay, maybe I take an extra week here, but on the next one, I'm going to put more hours on the weekend. I'm going to compress that one. So we can still finish our program within 6 months. If you don't do that weekly schedule, which happens with people, they lose track. You don't even know, and it's been months, and you're kind of still at the same course. Okay, so that can be unfortunate. We don't want that. We don't want that to happen. Okay. Now I'll take some questions from the chat because there are a few. So, how do I find the Facebook group? I will send out if you're in my email list. I can send out an email to join the group. I can also put the link here probably. So I'll give that to you guys in a second. Did you update the course 2 checklist for the new syllabus? So these are being updated as we speak. So probably we'll be getting out the checklist, the notes, all the updated stuff within the next week or two, I believe. So again, for now, I would use that checklist and use the TRESA notes that I'm going to give you guys. And that does remind me, I can actually, let me give you guys the notes right now. So give me a second here. I'm going to drop these notes here. And you guys should all be able to download it, I believe. So yeah, those are the notes. So download those. It's in the chat. But I would compare the checklist for the courses and the TRESA notes at the same time. Maria asks, I have a full-time job already. Does the 3-4 weeks plan work for me? So if you do have a full-time job, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. It's just a matter of making the commitment. Like, how do you make it work? Are you going to work the evenings? Are you going to study on the weekends? Set a specific time. Try to meet the same time every day. If your schedule is varied, the more routine you can add and structure is going to be very, very useful. So I won't say do this exactly, but I will say try to find structure, try to find routine, try to keep it consistent week by week, and then you'll just see the work will get taken care of. You study 2 hours, maybe it was shit session. You don't remember anything because you were tired. You study the next day, you had a good session. Next day is okay session. Next day is shit. Over time, you'll see that averages out, and you're just going to be making a lot of progress. Okay. Do they still offer extensions? I believe they do. So if you are going about an extension, go through Rico extensions. Those are better, faster. They kind of go through most often. Um, have you come across the C2 new modules? So there are different content depending on the colleges. So depending which one you bought it from, you'll have slightly different uh, kind of learning modules. The exams are relatively the same. Content will be taught slightly different. Um, but yeah, to mitigate that, again, I believe notes is probably the fastest way to compress your study time, just because no matter what college you're doing it with, the content they give you is likely to be very extensive and very long. Now, we all know, for those that have been with Humber, we all know how, well, repetitive and long and, boring it can be. I can't say the same about the other colleges yet because we don't have as much experience with that. But I'd highly still recommend using notes. So, once these notes are updated, I highly recommend taking those as well. Okay. So you guys can pop more questions if you have them. We're going to just cap this off by saying compressed timeline. It does not mean you have to study many, many hours a day. It doesn't mean you have to cram your study. And it doesn't mean taking the exam regardless of how you feel. You still need to adjust your confidence. Do I actually feel confident? It is a factor. Confidence does play a role in your score. Even if you study a lot, if you're not confident, you're unlikely to get a good score. And studying 6 hours is actually what I've seen, my experience. It actually is, there's diminishing returns the more you study in a day. The sweet spot for study, if you want to, let's say you had a week, you're off of work, or let's say a month. You have a month where you're off of work, you can study all day. I found the sweet spot to study a lot without burning out to be about 3 to 4 hours. That seems to maximize your memory, your retention, your energy without overdoing it. And we talk about deep work. If you guys know what deep work is a term that's used in business, which basically means like work that kind of advances your business forward, which usually takes all your energy. So studying, for example, takes a lot of energy if you're really focused. What that means is, well, if you do 3 to 4 hours, you're on the upper echelon. Like you're hitting the upper echelon of your focus time in a day. Like you're like humanly, your brain can't really take too much more if you're really, really focused. So if you do have all day to study, do 3 to 4 hours, make it focused, and then guilt-free leave it for the next day. 6 hours is unlikely to yield better results. Depends on the person. Like I said, you might be one of those people. Okay. Um, this is what I'd say in terms of what it would look like. Study consistently, do 5 to 8 focused hours per week, right? That's enough, 5 to 8 focused hours, and do weekly progress tracks. Remember, this is a marathon, not a sprint. Even though we're using sprints, it is a marathon, which just means that you got to make sure you're able to be consistent. If you finish course 2 in a month, that's great, unless you take 2 months off and then you're kind of back to where you started, right? Okay. And this is just some of the kind of general recap. Study the info guide, study the SRP form. That's 2 of the new forms you'll need. Study the TRESA notes I put in the chat. Do the MCQs framed under TRESA. So you may find those with Pass It. You can also draft them yourself. You pop in my notes into like ChatGPT. And obviously, if you're in my group, you'll be getting questions anyways. And create a small cheat sheet of new terms. This is better that you do on your own because new terms for you, when you write them down, you remember them better. So take those notes, look at new terms, jot them down, and that should help a little bit to study. I recommend doing this now, doing these stuff like in the next week. Try to make a sprint plan for this. What days are doing what? This is a really good way to get familiar and get running with TRESA. Okay. So I hope that was helpful. Give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down, a yes or no if this was good. It does give me good feedback. And I highly recommend, if you guys have feedback, please message me. I do obviously want to make these actually good for you guys and helpful. Um, and using this technique, we've had like many students like pass the courses. We've had like Brandon, he passed C2 in a few weeks. He was actually one of the students that have been with me for a little bit. He did C2 with me. I think he passed within about 6 weeks, and he had a good score. All he did, like you can see here, he just did 2, 3 hours per day. Again, this is just to show you that you guys can do this on your own as well, without Passive, without a group. I did my exams without Passive, which is crazy, but it's doable. We had like Elena, she passed every exam on the first attempt. She's done C1, C2, C3, C4 with me, all of this stuff. And we had, Nassim as well, another student. Just some of them, we have many students. Some of them are in the session today. So thank you guys so much for joining. You can definitely go to the channel, watch some of these other interviews if you'd like. These are people who are actually licensed today, some of the students I've tutored, and they have really good insights into real life. So if you do want to kind of see what real life looks like, what the transition was for them, how did they actually get their first deal, their first lease, those are very beneficial interviews. And like I said, download those free TRESA notes. Please do download these free stuff on the website. They're free for a reason, so take advantage of them. Use those. Um, and I have a lot of questions about the sessions. So for the sessions, basically, I'll give you guys a little bit of a kind of recap on the sessions. I mean, we do the monthly group sessions. I think the next ones we're starting is about next week. Essentially, what we do is we kind of do 5 classes, 2 classes a week. Takes us about 2.5 weeks to finish. And in those 5 classes, very much like this, we go through all the content, condensing it down to what you need. So what's important, what's not important, what do the questions look like? We go through all that content. You're with a group, which is really fun, actually. You get to talk with people, see them every week, keep tabs with each other, have accountability partners. We do that. And then after 3 weeks, most people, like, I think the pass rate's about 85, 90%. Most people are able to pass within about 4 weeks. And yeah, in the sessions, we kind of have the visuals, we have MCQs, a few hundred questions. You'll get recordings of every class. You get notes, bonuses, forms, everything basically that you need. So they're really fun. They're a good way to get started. They're also a really good way to be organized and not procrastinate. I've had a good amount of students who tell me, like, Shiva, like, I can do these by myself, but it's just a little bit easier to do it with a group, because you get to be with people that, you make it so you're not alone, you know. And it also makes it a lot easier. So instead of studying 4 hours, you can just study 2, because you know exactly kind of what's going to be on the exam. Um, in terms of like specific details, I won't bore everybody here. So if you guys do want specific fees, the timings exactly, send me a message anywhere, respond in an email, send me a messenger or my number, whatever it is. I can definitely tell you guys a little bit more. In terms of content, Maria says, do you provide content and those will be the only materials to study? So usually in the group sessions, I provide the content that you need to study, and I tell people not to study anything else. So you might buy the Humber Slide course, but realistically, I tell people not to use that to study. Because like I said before, it's very long. It's very repetitive. So you'll probably just be using the notes I give you, the MCQs I give you, the forms, the recordings, joining the class, and that's enough. Now, there are some students who say, Shiva, I kind of want more questions. They might go out, get some more questions from Passage or something, or they might go to the slides and study a little bit more detail because they like to. But most students, I'd say about 7 out of 10 students just kind of use what we give them, and it's usually enough. So that's also a nice way to kind of just get it organized.